The New Testament was written nearly 2,000 years ago. It was hand copied by early Christian scribes and passed down for generations. So here's the simple question. Are we reading what the original authors wrote? Because if the text changed in meaningful ways over time, that matters. And if it remains stable, well, that matters too. However, the only way to answer this question is through historical evidence, not personal opinion or emotion. We can ask questions like, how many manuscripts do we have? How early are they? And when we compare them, how closely do they align? That's how we find out whether the New Testament we hold today truly matches what its authors first wrote, and whether our trust in it rests on solid ground. So, how much manuscript evidence do we actually have? Now, the Institute for New Testament Textual Research, located in Germany, is the primary worldwide institution responsible for keeping track of the Greek New Testament manuscripts. And at the time of this video, they currently list over 6,000 Greek manuscripts. And the number continues to grow. Some are complete books, many are partial. These manuscripts date back to the 2nd century AD and extend all the way into the 1500s, with some of the earliest copies appearing within about a century of the originals. That means that we're not dealing with one fragile chain of copying, but thousands of copies spread across centuries and regions. And that's only counting the Greek. If we include early translations into Latin and other ancient languages, the total number of handwritten copies rises to well over 20,000. Now, remember, we're treating the New Testament the same way we would evaluate any other ancient text. So, to put this in perspective, how does it compare to other ancient works? Well, among non-biblical works, the book with the next greatest number of surviving manuscripts is Homer's Iliad. It's one of the most well-preserved works of ancient literature. And it has roughly 1,800 to 2,000 Greek manuscripts. Many other classical works survive only in a few dozen copies. Some are even fewer than that. The New Testament, by contrast, doesn't survive in a few thousand copies like the Iliad. It survives in more than 3 times that number. So, the sheer number of manuscripts we have to compare when measuring for accuracy and testing whether we're reading the original text is massive by ancient standards. In other words, a lack of data is not a problem. But quantity alone isn't enough. The next question is, how early are our manuscripts? And here's why that matters. The longer the gap between the original writing and our earliest surviving manuscript, the more opportunity there is for changes to occur before we have anything to check it against. So let's compare fairly. Homer's Iliad was composed around the 8th century BC. The earliest surviving copies we possess date to roughly the 3rd century BC, about 400 to 500 years later. Now, consider the New Testament. The books of the New Testament were written between approximately AD 50 and AD 100. Yet we have manuscript fragments dated to the 2nd century AD. For example, a small fragment of John's Gospel, known as P52, is commonly dated around AD 125 to 50. Since John's Gospel is usually dated around AD 90, that places this fragment roughly 25 to 60 years after it was written. That may sound like a long time to us, but in ancient history, a gap of only a few decades is incredibly tight, especially when many other ancient works are separated from their earliest surviving copies by 4, 5, or even 10 centuries. With Homer, roughly 4 to 5 centuries pass before we can begin comparing surviving copies. With the New Testament, that comparison begins within decades. Now, that does not automatically prove perfection, but it does mean there was far less time for the text to drift before we have copies to examine. When it comes to how early our evidence begins, the New Testament stands unusually close to its original writing compared to other ancient books. And that closeness matters when we're asking whether we're still reading what the original authors actually wrote. So now we come to the third question. How accurate are these manuscripts when we compare them? Well, textual critic Bart Ehrman notes that scholars estimate that there could be 200,000, 300,000, even 400,000 or more textual variants among the New Testament manuscripts. He also points out that there are more variants among the manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Now, that can sound devastating. It creates the impression that the text is very unstable, that maybe not even a single word has gone untouched. But before jumping to that conclusion, we need to ask an important question. What exactly is a variant? Now, as New Testament textual critic and scholar Daniel Wallace explains, a variant is simply any place where the manuscripts differ from one another. Whether that difference is a single letter, a spelling variation, a change in word order, or a missing or added phrase. For example, one of the most common kinds of variants involves simple spelling differences, like the spelling between the word color or color. The meaning doesn't change at all, yet every time a small spelling difference like that appears in a manuscript, it's counted as a separate variant. There are also places where some of the manuscripts read Lord while others read Jesus, or whether the name John is spelled with one N, or in many manuscripts, two N's. In English, it still reads John, but in Greek, that minor spelling difference is counted as its own variant. In fact, over half of these spelling differences cannot even be reflected into the English language. They have absolutely no impact on the text meaning. Now, that doesn't mean that every verse is beyond discussion. There are a handful of well-known passages, such as the longer ending of Mark chapter 16, verse 9 through 20, and the story of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 7, verse 53 through chapter 8, verse 11. Both of these sections are not found in the earliest manuscripts. Now, this is not hidden information. Most modern Bibles clearly note this in the text or in the footnotes. And Whether those passages are included or not, no core Christian doctrine is affected. Now, another example is in Romans chapter 5, verse 1, where it is debated among scholars whether Paul wrote, "We have peace," or "Let us have peace." See, scholars examine these differences and carefully ask which reading is most likely the original. Even in cases like these, the variations are openly acknowledged in modern Bibles and relatively small in number. None of them introduce new core doctrines or remove established ones. When it comes to the overall message, the historical claims, and the central teachings, the text remains stable. It's also important to keep something else in mind. We have over 20,000 New Testament manuscripts. They span centuries and come from different regions and languages. When you compare that many documents, the differences are inevitable. And once you understand what actually counts as a variant, even a single letter change or spelling difference, the large number is no longer shocking. In fact, with that many manuscripts, it's actually remarkable that the number isn't even greater. So, when we ask whether today's New Testament reflects what the original authors wrote, the manuscript evidence does not point to chaos or some sort of corruption. It points to a text that has been transmitted with a high degree of stability, carefully copied, widely distributed, and thoroughly examined. So we can be confident that the New Testament we hold today accurately reflects what the original authors wrote. The idea that the New Testament has been hopelessly corrupted simply doesn't hold up. So here is the real question. Is what the scriptures say about Jesus true? Will you actually take the time to weigh the evidence and decide? If these words have been faithfully preserved, then the claims about who Jesus is and what he did still stand today. See, they confront us now just as directly as they confronted the first readers. The issue here is no longer transmission, it's response before the gates.